acquired some land. Do you remember what it was, anyone? By virtue of our victory in the Mexican War? Okay, so yeah. And it was New Mexico, Arizona, and the southern part of California. Well, there were mixed opinions upon prominent politicians on what we should do with that land, right? And what's the issue that we're going to be discussing?
Free slave versus slave.
Absolutely, slavery. And so there were 5 prominent politicians that had opinions on this, and I'm going to give you those 5 prominent politicians and what their opinions were concerning slavery in lands that we had received as a result of our victory in the Mexican War. First person we're going to talk about is our President of the United States. I'll refresh your memory. James K. Polk, P-O-L-K, was our president this time. We went through that just before Christmas. And he had an opinion on what should be done with the lands that we acquired from Mexico concerning slavery. I thought he did it the simplest. He said, well, let's just go by the Missouri Compromise and the 36th parallel 30. Anything in the new lands north of that would be free, and anything south would be slave. That was his opinion on slavery in lands acquired from Mexico. We'll just go by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Any lands that we acquired from Mexico that are north of 3630 will be free. Anything south will be slave. That made sense to him. Well, you had a Democratic congressman by the name of David Wilmot who had a different view of slavery in the lands that we acquired from Mexico. And Democratic Congressman David Wilmot opposed slavery in any of the new lands we acquired. He didn't believe slavery should be introduced to any of those lands that we acquired from Mexico as a virtue of our victory in the Mexican War. So you have 2 different politicians and 2 different opinions. Now, do you remember who now is an elder statesman by the name of John C. Calhoun? He had an opinion, and he stated publicly that no one had the right to prohibit slavery in these lands we acquired from Mexico. So what is he an advocate for if he says no one can prohibit it? He's for slavery. So you got one person, the president, who thinks we just live by the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and anything north of 3630 is free, anything south is slave. Congressman David Wilmot, a Democrat, believes there shouldn't be any slavery, and John C. Calhoun, who's an elder statesman at this time, thinks that it should be all slavery. Well, 2 other politicians had an opinion. A Michigan senator by the name of Ccus and an Illinois senator by the name of Stephen Douglas agreed on their opinion. Those 2 guys had the same opinion. And they thought that the people that lived in the territory should be the ones deciding whether it was free or slave. So what those 2 guys are saying is, hey, if the people of New Mexico want slavery, they can pick that. Now, if they were a state, we would call that what? But they're not a state. We'd call that states' rights, the ability to make your own decision. So do you see the various opinions? The President of the United States, James K. Polk, thinks we should use the Missouri Compromise and the 3630 lines to decide. Democratic Congressman David Wilmot doesn't think there should be any slavery in the new lands acquired from Mexico. Elder statesman John C. Calhoun doesn't believe that anyone can prohibit slavery in the new lands. That way they would be, in his opinion, slave. And Michigan Senator Ccus and Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas think that the people that live in those territories should decide what happens in their territory. Well, excuse me, before we can get this settled, we have a presidential election, which is our next subtopic, the election of 1848. But keep in mind, kiddos, that this issue over what to do with lands that we secured from Mexico is not solved yet, okay? Now, what 2 political parties? I'm telling you, the other class was really on fire today. Unbelievable. I was really surprised. They did the 16 days, didn't get them, and they got some of this stuff, and I want to make sure you can compete a little bit here. So what are the 2 political parties we have right now? I'll give you a hint like I gave them. The Republican Party is...
Is it the Whigs?
That a girl. The Whigs and the... Yeah! 16 days didn't hurt you guys either. So we got the Whigs and the Democrats. Now, first of all, You have to understand that the problem of slavery in the Mexican territories is going to be the hot topic of discussion, right? That's what they're going to be talking about. Well, the two political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, both kind of ignored it because they thought if they took a firm stand either way, they would what? Lose the election. So, typical politics, neither the Democratic Party nor the Whig Party took a firm stand on the issue because they thought it would cost them the election. Now, President Polk has a chance to run for re-election, right? But he chooses not to. So the Democrats nominate Michigan Senator Ccus, who we just talked about, as their candidate for president. Now, since none of you probably have ever heard of Ccus prior to today, it's a pretty good guess that he did not win this election, right? So, but he is going to be the Democratic nominee. Now, the Whig Party went way out there, and they nominated, if you can remember, old Mexican War General Zachary Taylor for the presidency. Now that was kind of comical because Zachary Taylor was just what he was. He was a general. He had absolutely no political experience and didn't even really have any political views. He was the most non-politician candidate you could find. Okay? Now you're thinking, because I've never heard of Ccus, he must have won. Well, we'll see. Well, what happens when your candidates aren't gaining much enthusiasm? What normally happens in an election?
A third party.
Boy, third party came in, the Free Soil Party. Now, if anybody, oh man, I don't know if you talk to the class, I'll find out soon. If anybody can name me or tell me who their candidate was, the Free Soil Party, I'll give you 5 points extra credit to start this out. Now, we have talked about him before in this particular class, and I'll give you the same hint I gave them. They couldn't get this. Former president. So anybody want to take a shot at who the Free Soil Party candidate is in 1848? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Martin Van Buren, yeah! Martin Van Buren, you're one up on the other class right now. Martin Van Buren was their candidate. Now you've heard of him before, haven't you? Well, let me tell you something about a third party. And this happened in the election in which George H.W. Bush, George Sr., ran against Bill Clinton the first time. A third party came in, the Independent Party, and a guy named Ross Perot ran on that party. Maybe you've heard of him, I don't know, it was a while ago. Well, Ross Perot didn't win one electoral, state. He didn't win a vote electorally. He didn't win any states. But people that normally would have voted for George H.W. Bush voted for him, which gave Bill Clinton the presidency, which was a huge upset because everybody was in shock that Bush 1 did not get reelected because he was fairly popular. Okay? Same thing happens in this election. The Free Soil Party isn't going to carry a single state, but people that would have normally voted for the Democratic candidate Ccus voted for Martin Van Buren, which gave Zachary Taylor the election. And he becomes the nation's 12th president, and he has absolutely no political experience and absolutely no political views. Unbelievable. Bad candidate. Historians once described him as a square peg trying to fit in a round hole. That's how off he was on the presidency. Okay? So Zachary Taylor, this guy right here, is now your 12th president of the United States. And it's kind of interesting because we're going to have another crisis calling for compromise that he's going to be in the middle of. Okay? Which is our next subtopic. Another crisis calling for compromise. This whole subtopic, or this whole topic for this lecture is dealing with crisis and compromise. And what's it all have to do with? Slavery, right? Free and slave states, etc. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tell you that more controversy surrounded the nation as both Northerners and Southerners were upset about 4 major issues concerning slavery in the United States. And I'm going to tell you what these 4 major issues are and which side, either the North or South, was upset about. Okay? 4 different issues and which side was upset. We'll start with the first issue. And the first issue was that California had applied for admission into the Union. And they wanted to come in as a free state. So that's going to upset the balance, right? Because weren't we even in 1848 when Iowa and Wisconsin came in as free states? So who's going to be upset about this major issue? South, yeah, because they're losing their balance. So the first major issue that upset either Northerners or Southerners was the fact that California had applied for admission into the Union as a free state, and it upset the Southerners as the balance of free and slave states would be disrupted. Now, the next thing, number two, the next major issue concerning slavery, upset both Northerners and Southerners. And that was the fact that no one had ever made a decision on what we were going to do with the lands that we acquired from Mexico. Zachary Taylor's administration didn't exactly address that. And so both Northerners and Southerners were upset because that issue had not been taken care of yet. There's still the question mark in those lands. That make sense? Okay, the third major issue concerning slavery across the country that upset either the North or the South was... Is that my phone back there?
Yeah.
Well, we'll let it ring. It's on tape. Who didn't put the phone on? After I took the picture. So what's the penalty for that? I lose my participation points for the week. Okay, deal. Deal. 41 ice cream.
Oh.
Okay, she said ice cream, good penalty. Okay. The third major issue is that Southerners were upset because Northerners were supporting a law that would abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. Okay? In other words, if you can believe it, our nation's capital was a slave area. And you could own and buy and sell slaves in that area. And the Northerners didn't like that. They didn't think the nation's capital should be a place where you can buy and sell and have slaves. So they were pushing a bill that would abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. Who did that upset? Southerners, right? And the fourth major issue concerning slavery across the country made the Northerners upset because the Southerners were requesting a fugitive slave law in the North. Northerners were upset because Southerners were forcing and wanting to have a fugitive slave law in the North. Anybody in here know what a fugitive slave law is? Go ahead, Jaden.
If a slave escaped to a northern state and they caught him, they would have to return him.
They would have to return him, and they obviously are doing that because they're against slavery. So, the North is upset because the South wants a fugitive slave law established that's effective in the North. Now, any of these issues, excuse me, could lead America to civil war. So what do we need to make sure we don't go to civil war? Another compromise, which is going to be known as the compromise, of 1850. Very important piece of our history, although it puts a Band-Aid on our problem, it doesn't solve it. Okay? Now, somebody's going to have to come in here and be the great compromiser. Who's that going to be? Henry Clay, very good. And he's going to come in. He's aged, he's ill, he's weary. This will be his last stand politically, and he's going to be the guy, because Zachary Taylor doesn't have the moxie, right, to come in here and come up with a compromise to keep the United States from going into a civil war over these issues over slavery. Now, Clay's compromise is going to go down in American history as the Compromise of 1850, and I'm going to give you the 5 proposals that Clay made. Now, Clay makes these 5 proposals, and then who's going to have to mull over them and vote on them? Congress, both the House and the Senate, okay? So he's got to make a pretty good argument here. So here is the 5 compromises or proposals that Clay made. First of all, his number one proposal was we will admit California into the Union as a free state. California will be admitted into the Union as a free state. That was the first proposal. Now, what's something that somebody was upset about? Were people upset because the land that we acquired from Mexico wasn't settled? Right? So what his second proposal was, is we're going to organize that land. Now, we're not going to organize California because it's going to be admitted as a state. But we're going to organize the land that was acquired from Mexico, except for California, and we're going to base their decisions on popular sovereignty. Okay, and that makes sense in a minute. So the second proposal by Henry Clay that made up the Compromise of 1850 is we were going to organize the land that was acquired from Mexico, except for California, because we're going to admit that in as a free state, and we're going to use popular sovereignty in those territories. Anybody know what that means? Yeah, good.
Doesn't it mean that, like, basically they get a vote on whether they want to?
Who's they?
The people,
In?
the state.
It was a territory, but you're right. Yeah, popular sovereignty would be states' rights if you were a state. Popular sovereignty means that whatever the population says they want to do in an area in which they inhabit, that's what they do. So basically what he's saying in this proposal is that when we organize this land, we will allow the people that live there to decide. Is exactly what Ccus and Stephen Douglas proposed earlier, right? They said that? Okay, perfect. The third proposal, and it was kind of interesting because before they could organize the land, that doggone Texas was claiming part of the Mexico territory. They claimed it, and so if this proposal doesn't go, heck, Texas might look like this. I mean, who knows? So what happened is Texas had made a claim to some of the New Mexico territory. And Henry Clay's third proposal was, hey, I tell you what we're going to do. The federal government's going to give Texas $10 million, and Texas is going to disclaim any land they have in New Mexico. So his proposal was to give the state of Texas $10 million, and Texas would abandon any claims they had on any lands in New Mexico because they wanted New Mexico to be its own territory, which they knew eventually would become what? A state. Okay? So that was the third proposal. Okay, what's another issue that was a disagreement? How about that District of Columbia, right? So his fourth proposal was that they would abolish the buying and selling of slaves in the District of Columbia. They would abolish the buying and selling of slaves in the District of Columbia. That raise any questions from anybody?
Can you still own slaves?
There you go. You can still own slaves. It didn't abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. It just abolished the buying and selling. So really, did he have kind of a compromise within his compromise there? And that's what he did, trying to please both sides. And the fifth, you can probably guess what his fifth proposal was, is they would enact a strict fugitive slave law in the North, in which slaves that ran away to the North, if caught, would be, by law, required to be returned to their owners. So, that was his proposal. Admit California into the Union as a free state, organize the land we got from Mexico with the exception of California, and put it under popular sovereignty, where the people decide, pay $10 million to Texas so they'll get rid of their claim on lands they had in New Mexico, abolish the buying and selling of slaves in the District of Columbia, and enact an effective fugitive slave law in the North. So, that was proposed to the House and the Senate, and they pondered that for 6 months. They, talked about that back and forth. What would normally happen if you took that long to think about it? You might do what?
Forget about it.
What? Forget about it, maybe. You could do that, or what might you do to his proposals? Change them up a little bit. Ironically, they did not. They studied these proposals for 6 months. They debated on them. And in September of 1850, both houses of Congress adopted all 5 of Clay's proposals by large margins. So he was this was Henry Clay's crowning moment as a politician. Greatest thing he did as a politician was the Compromise of 1850. Because did it keep us out of civil war? It sure did. Eventually, the slavery issue is just going to be too much, and we're going to end up there. But for this point in history, he saved the nation from a civil war. Now, who signed that bill into law, the Compromise of 1850?
Zachary.
Zachary Taylor would have, but he died in office. Okay? Zachary Taylor died in office in July of 1850. A couple months before that was approved. And so his vice president, Millard Fillmore, this guy right here, he assumed the presidency, and it was actually Millard Fillmore that signed into law the Compromise of 1850. So Zachary Taylor dies in office in July of 1850, and Millard Fillmore signs the bill in September of 1850. And the Compromise of 1850 temporarily saves the day for the United States, avoiding a civil war. Okay, everybody good on that? Okay, let's talk about the election of 1852. Then we're going to have a little fun. We're into that, aren't we?
Yes.
Now, I will tell you right now that Millard Fillmore didn't thrill anybody during the time that he served out the remainder of Zachary Taylor's term. So he's not going to be in the picture at all for the Whigs, okay? Well, let's start with the Democrats. The Democrats are going to nominate Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire as their presidential candidate. Franklin Pierce. Now, I will give another 5 points extra credit if anybody can tell me who the Whigs nominated, going back to their old philosophy in 1848 of looking at an old, worn-out military general. Now, the other class got this one, but they didn't get that one, so that'd be kind of interesting. Yes?